Okay, so as I said, I'm a tax lawyer, so I love to talk about legal stuff. This was basically, I put this in because this has been so widely distributed that I got concerned that people might make too much of this. So this is just my caveats about, this is really my summary. This is not, the IRS has also helped distribute this, the person I deal with the VITA program, but this is not something that's been approved by the IRS or anything. These are just my own thoughts. So that's the purpose for the caveat. Okay, we can go on the next page. Okay, so as you all know, Congress has passed significant legislation recently to deal with coronavirus in hopes of basically re-stimulating the economy. And one of the most significant pieces of this, there are lots of pieces to this, but one of the big pieces is this economic impact payment that we're going to talk about today. You can switch. Okay, so the first thing is, so how big of payments are we talking about here? So basically it's $1,200 a person, plus you get an additional $500 for each qualifying child under the age of 17. So a qualifying child, that's a tax term, of course, but it's basically a child or a grandchild, and there are certain other relatives that can qualify, but that's pretty limited. But most of the time it's a child or a grandchild who's under the age of 17. And on the taxpayer's return for 2019 or 2018, if they didn't file, they could have claimed a child tax credit for that person. That's based on a variety of tests about, did they live with them? The child didn't support themselves more than 50%, things like that. But generally, if they have a child or a grandchild that lives with them that's under the age of 17, they're going to qualify as a qualifying child, and thus they'll get the $500 as well. So if we're looking at a married couple then with two kids under age of 17, they get $3,400, $1,200 each for the couple, plus another $500 for each of the children. So that's generally the amount of the payments we're talking about here. So you've heard a lot about the $1,200, I'm sure, and that's basically what people are getting. Now that amount at higher income levels, which I doubt seriously your clients are going to run into this problem, but at higher income levels, that does phase down and eventually phases out. So there can be situations where people don't get the full $1,200, but that's generally the amount that people will get. So I've given you some of the income numbers. You can see those are pretty high income numbers before you have to worry about any kind of phase out. There's no minimum amount of income that's required. So basically everybody who's a qualifying person for receiving these that we're going to talk about in a second will get these without regard to their income level. Okay, so who's going to get this? Basically anybody, you have to be a US citizen or resident, and you have to have a Social Security card that enables the person to work in the US. So a resident is, I imagine most of the people that you're dealing with are probably US citizens. A resident, somebody who basically lives in the US for more than half the year. And that's purely based on how long you live there. It's not based on whether you're legal immigrant, illegal immigrant, anything like that, for purposes of the residence test. But then they've added this Social Security test, which basically says you've got to have a Social Security card that would allow you to work in the US. That's the same test that's used today for earned income credit and for the child tax credit. So again, most of your clients, I'm sure, that have kids are able to take the earned income credit and potentially a child tax credit as well. So this is basically the same test as what's applied there. So it's just looking for having a Social Security card that allows you to work in the United States. So if you're a non-resident alien or somebody from outside who just has what's called an individual taxpayer identification number, it starts with the Social Security card starts with a 9, they're not entitled to these payments. And it's about, my understanding from the IRS, it's about 150 million households will get these payments. So that's most of the country is going to get this for sure. The $500 payment for qualifying children under the age of 17 is based on their status on the 2019 tax return. So everything here you'll see throughout this kind of keeps looking back to the 2019 tax return if they filed a 2019 return. If they have not filed a 2019 return, but they filed 2018, it'll go back to the 2018 return. And then there are also some other situations. This is where all the complexity is coming in now that the IRS keeps throwing out new things. And one of them is There are also some situations where they're going to look at the 2020 return to make changes to any payments that were made. So we'll talk about that in a bit as well. Okay. So who's not going to get a payment? This text is getting pretty small here because there's so much stuff I've had to add. There are basically two categories of people that aren't going to get a payment. One is a non-resident alien, so somebody who lived in the U.S. generally for less than half the year and they weren't a U.S. citizen or a U.S. permanent resident, green card holder. But then they also added this new thing the other day. It says if you're non-resident for 2019, but you become a resident alien for 2020, so you're in the U.S. less than half the year in 19, but more than half in 20, you can claim this $1,200 payment on your 2020 tax return. So that's something new they just added on Friday. The other group of people who do not qualify are people who can be claimed as a dependent on the tax return of another person. So generally, there are two groups of people that we tend to see that fall into this category. One is, as I said before, the qualifying children for purposes of the $500 payment are kids under the age of 17. But if you have a child who's over 16, who still lives with you, or for example, college students is another group that we see a lot of, but you're still supporting that child, so you're claiming them as a dependent on your return. They're not claiming themselves yet. In that situation, that child does not get the $1,200 payment because you're claiming them as a dependent, and they also don't get the $500 because they're over the age of 16. So that's a category of people that kind of lose out in this. So there's been a lot of complaints about that. Congress may change that, but at least at this point, that's the rule that Congress came up with. The other group that we tend to see a lot of is our parents who, as they've grown older, their grown children end up supporting them. So they're providing more than half the support of the parents. So they get to claim the parents as a dependent on their return. They get to take what's called the other dependent credit. If you do that, the parents also are not entitled to the $1,200 credit. So that's the main two groups of dependents that are not going to be entitled to these payments. And then they threw in this one other funny little rule. It says if you have a couple that files a joint return and one of the spouses has a Social Security card that entitles them to work in the U.S., but the other spouse does not, then both of them lose in the situation. They don't, neither one gets a payment. There's an exception to that rule for military. So if it's military where one spouse has, one of the spouses is military, and also one of the spouses that may be the same spouse who the other spouse has a SSN that allows them to work in the U.S., they still get the $2,400. So this is a funny rule. I'm not quite sure why Congress put that one in. Hopefully that's not a situation that you guys see very often, but it's one of those where you fall through the cracks if one of the spouses on a joint return is not able to work in, doesn't have a Social Security card that allows them to work in the U.S. Okay. So what do I need to do to get the payment? This is the big question, and this has gone out to, as I say, lots of other folks, including people at the Senior Center and stuff, and we're getting lots of questions about these things. So this is probably the most important piece, is to understand what do people need to do. So fortunately, the first group of people who automatically receive payments, that group has been expanding over the last week or so. So right now, the people who automatically receive a payment are anybody who filed a tax return for 2018 or 2019. So if you filed a return for 18 or 19, there's nothing you need to do to be able to get this payment. You're automatically going to get it. The other group is because of filing requirements, people who are on Social Security, SSDI, railroad retirement benefits, which is basically the equivalent of Social Security for people who work in the railroad industry. And now that's also been extended, to supplemental Social Security income, SSI, and veteran affairs benefits. So for all of these people, generally those benefits are not taxed, or taxed at pretty low amounts, and lower incomes aren't taxed at all. So a lot of those people, so we deal with a lot of those folks at the Senior Center who come in who have maybe a small pension, and then they also receive Social Security. They don't end up having enough taxable income to have to file a return. So they didn't file for 2018 or 19. They're still entitled to a payment, And what the IRS has done over the last week or so is basically create this second group of people who get Social Security, SSDI, Railroad Retirement Supplemental Security, and Veterans Affairs. All of those people now will automatically receive a payment. They don't have to do anything to be able to receive a payment. It's clear that for the Social Security, Railroad Retirement, and SSDI, they're going to look to what happened in 2019. They're going to look to get what's called a form SSA 1099, which reports your Social Security benefits. There's a similar one for Railroad Retirement. If you got one of those in 2019, they will automatically pay it to you based on that. But if you didn't start on Social Security until 2020, you don't get caught into that net. So you've got to actually take additional steps if you didn't start on Social Security until 2020. So those are the groups that basically get automated. So those are the easy ones. Everybody else has got to do something. And so let's talk about what that is. So one is somebody receives Social Security. They don't need to do anything to receive a payment. But if they also have a child under the age of 17, it could be a grandchild, for example, under the age of 17, so that they're entitled to that extra $500. Obviously, the IRS isn't going to know that from just the fact that they got Social Security. So if you've got clients who are in that situation, so they're on Social Security, for example, or SSDI, they have a child who would qualify for the $500, they're going to have to take some additional steps that we're going to talk about in a minute, the non-filer. They're going to have to go on the non-filer tool to be able to get that $500 payment. If they don't do that, they'll just get their $1,200. They can still get the $500 on their 2020 tax return, but if they want it now, they're going to have to take some steps, and we're going to talk about what those are. So here's the group of people who, as I said before, if you file the 2018 or 2019 tax return, you're automatic, easy to deal with. You don't have to do anything for those folks. If you didn't file 2018 or 19 and you didn't get Social Security or something like that, then there's a whole host of things that happens here. So you don't automatically qualify. If you don't automatically qualify, you're required to file a 2019 tax return. So you made enough money that you've got to file a 2019 tax return, but you've not filed that yet, nor have you filed for 2018. So then you're not in the IRS system, basically. They're only looking at 19 and 18. You've got to file a tax return for 18 or 19 to be able to receive the payment. So if you've got people who basically haven't filed for a few years, but they made enough money in 2019 that they need to file, they're going to have to file a return to be able to get a payment. I'm going to talk about later how they can file those returns, but that's the group that actually has to go file a tax return. Okay, the next group is you don't automatically qualify, but your income was below the level required to file. In that situation, again, if you've got Social Security, you don't really have to do anything if it's just for you. If you didn't get Social Security, though, but your income was low enough that you weren't required to file for 2019, you either have to file a tax return or you have to complete this simplified return that we're going to talk a lot about for non-filers. So again, you may have quite a few people in that situation. So this would be people, for example, last year they were not employed. They've now gotten a job in 2020, for example, but in 2019, they weren't employed. They didn't have to file for 2018 or 19 because they didn't have enough income, but they weren't receiving any of these special governmental payments that would make them automatically qualify. They're going to have to go online and fill out this simplified return that we're going to talk about. There's also an issue for people who are on Social Security and should have filed, but they didn't file for 2018 and 19. It looks like in that situation, they're going to automatically get their payment, but that's not absolutely clear. That's certainly not what IRS would like to happen. They keep saying if you have to file, you should go ahead and file. But they also say that people who get Social Security are going to automatically receive these payments. So I think they're going to automatically get the payments, but I'm not positive on that one. Okay. So if I didn't need to file, what do I do to get a payment? So this is where you're going to have to go online to the irs.gov and fill out this thing called the non-filer tool. So in the next couple of pages, I talk specifically about how you get there. So this is information that if you need to fill this out, that you would want to use these pages to do that, or provide it to other folks who are curious about how to do that. So you just go on irs.gov, you click this non-filers enter payment info here. You have to set up a username and password. Okay, you'll go to the next page. And then here's a whole list of information that that tool is going to look for. Now, what's interesting in that is it doesn't ask for any income information at all. So it's not like a regular tax return. It's not asking for how much money did you make or anything like that. All it's asking for is kind of the basic details of your address, your social security numbers, those kind of things, your filing status, and it's here, it's very simplified. It's either married filing joint or it's single. So if you're doing a married filing joint return, you click that. You're doing any other return, so that's a head of household, single, married filing separate, any of those, you just click the single box. The bank account information, we're going to talk about that a lot later on. That's to be able to do direct deposit, which means you'll get your money much faster if you do direct deposit. Identity protection pins, those are things for people who've had their identity stolen. Don't see those too often, but we do occasionally. They do ask for driver's license information. Again, if you have a dependent under the age of 17, this is how you tell the IRS about that if you didn't file a return for 2018 and 19. And then they also ask for basically what's called your adjusted gross income on your 2018 tax return. Now, since these are situations where people didn't file for 18 and 19 and didn't need to file, are supposed to be in this category, that's typically going to be zero. So you would just enter 0